I had an idea a little while ago. 5 episodes into a podcast, probably not ideal timing to introduce a new format, but stick with me. I was watching a movie and I was looking at its 97 sequels, and I thought, it's a lot of sequels. Why are there so many sequels? And then I got into this massive rabbit hole looking at like oral histories and making of DVD bonus clips. And by the end of it, I had some really strong opinions on the films as they ranked against each other, but also this like frantic interest in franchises. How do they start? Why do they start? Why do they keep going? And I thought you might be interested in those things too. So I thought once every few episodes, we could look at a film franchise and pick it apart a little bit, like some sort of digital vulture with a streaming subscription. Consider this a trial run. If you don't like it, let me know. I'm Alex. This is Pop Culture Boner, the podcast edition. And today I'm thinking about the anatomy of the Purge franchise. When I first started mulling this idea over, it was suggested that I think about something like the Marvel or Star Wars movies. I think probably because at this point there are hundreds of them, and they're maybe the prime example of franchises with kind of fractured histories and complicated fan cultures surrounding them that are really easy to pull apart from a few different angles. But I'm an asshole who likes to cause herself pain, and so I thought maybe I'll start somewhere smaller. There's something kind of perversely fascinating to me about like a two-movie franchise with a weird spin-off that no one likes. Something where you're watching it and you're thinking, why? Which coked out movie exec signed off on this? So, when thinking about the anatomy of a franchise, I wanted to start somewhere that was kind of large enough for me to sink my teeth into, but niche enough that its success still seems kind of odd. Horror seemed like a pretty good place to start, because modern horror movies almost always have sequels, and because horror as a genre is kind of reasonably niche. People are either dedicated freaks or they'd rather die than watch one outside of Halloween. Horror is also a good jump off point because they're usually really obvious allegories for real world fears. The monsters usually mean something. Aliens are about xenophobia, vampires are about sexuality, zombies are about, well, like a lot of things depending on when the film was made. I'm obviously massively oversimplifying something that can be quite nuanced, but a lot of the time, depending on the budget and the writing, it can actually be that simple. As for why I chose The Purge, a couple of reasons. First of all, it was on my mind. I was watching the TV series and I was surprised by how much I really enjoyed it, given that I'd enjoyed the premise of the first film, but not actually the execution. And secondly, the monster in the Purge franchise is the government and the American class system. And not in like a subtle way. Like the horror literally comes from taking pre existing dystopian elements of American life and just kind of amplifying them. And the world is a horror show right now. I think I said last week when I was talking about conspiracy theories that the pandemic was really ruining some shit. Please be assured, in the short space of time between finishing up writing that episode and commencing writing this one, things have gotten significantly worse. And I don't want to trivialize that by trying to get too in depth on them in a podcast that is ultimately meant to be a bit of fun. But it seemed like an appropriate time to think about why one of the most successful horror franchises of the last decade might be experiencing some of that success in the current political climate given those themes. So, without further ado, let's get into The Purge. What is it? Why is it? How did it? The Purge universe hinges on a central idea that in order to reform America and save it from full-blown economic collapse, all crime, including murder, is legal for 12 hours once a year as a way of letting the public express their frustration. The theory goes that having rammed a knife into their neighbor's ear canal during some state-sanctioned mayhem, ordinary citizens emerge 12 hours later as productive members of society, free of violent impulse. When the film first premiered in 2013, much was made of this concept, but in reality, the film itself reads like a pretty standard home invasion horror. Set in a gated community, the film follows a family as they lock down for the 12 hours of the purge using the security system that the father sells for a living. Their young son briefly unlocks their door for a wounded stranger, perhaps unsurprisingly identified as the stranger throughout, who is being chased by masked purgers, who then break into the house to retrieve their victim. When the neighbors arrive, it turns out it's not to help, but to exact their revenge over the family for having nicer kitchen countertops and a backyard swimming pool or something. Basically, masked creeps try and break into a house, and help is not forthcoming. Part of the horror of most home invasion movies is derived from the idea of help somehow not being available, and that can be quite hard to convincingly set up in a post-smartphone world. So, a lot of the time, you'll see these movies set in isolated rural areas, or the protagonist will have some sort of physical disability that renders the usual channels of help and support useless. Funny Games or The Strangers, for example, are both set in kind of physically isolated houses, and in Funny Games particularly, some of the horror comes from help being only very slightly out of reach. Whereas something like Hush has a protagonist who is both deaf and unable to speak, which makes her path to survival kind of less obvious. I'm only throwing films out here that work kind of hard to convincingly establish these scenarios, but a lot of the time for more run-of-the-mill films, it'll just be a really lazy throwaway line of exposition at the beginning of the movie, where the main character waves her phone in the air and goes, "No cell service." And then her husband's like, "Good, because this is a romantic weekend designed to fix all of our marriage problems, and you check your emails too much anyway." So, the fact that The Purge set this up to happen in a fairly heavily populated area meant that it was always trying to do something a little bit different. Whether or not it succeeded is another thing. The rules of Purge Night and some of its history are established by a brief jaunt through the neighborhood. We see people participating in acts of patriotism, and we get some sweeping shots of the houses, which feature American flags prominently. But ultimately, the security system kicks in and it just kind of becomes people trapped in the house. In an oral history told to the LA Times, the writer and director James DeMonaco says, "There was a part of me that was very angry with the scope of the first film. It's a night of legal crime in America, and I think a lot of people were kind of thrown that I stayed inside one house. We knew that that would be an issue, but we had no budget." He goes on to mention that Ethan Hawke slept on his sofa for the duration of the shoot, which I think is a delightful anecdote about probable workplace health and safety violations. Anyway, I remember watching this movie and I was really frustrated because I could kind of see the idea lurking on the edges of the screen. We get glimpses of the outside world, like news reports of mass violence, gunfire in the distance, even an entire treatise on class delivered as a monologue by a machete-wielding teenager. And yet it's still like a huge night of legal crime. You'd expect sort of mass bloodshed on a scale normally relegated to slasher flicks, and instead we're stuck with people kind of fighting in a box. The gore's still there, but it's claustrophobic on the same level as something like the Saw movies, which almost defeats the purpose. But the film significantly exceeded its box office expectations. The cynical part of me thinks this might be done to the marketing, which really focused on the whole night of legal crime part of the film. You can really go either way with a concept like this, as loosely executed as it was, and I think there's something appealing about that level of lawlessness to a particular type of person. Not me, personally. I've always said that in the spectrum of characters in an apocalypse movie, I would be the corpse that the main character stumbles across in an abandoned house that's like a little bit rotted and is a symbolic reminder of how bad it got. I'm not designed for survival scenarios. I'm really bad at cardio. Anyway, the slightly more hopeful part of me thinks that people noticed what the film was trying to do with the politics. The stranger is black and poor, and we can assume that without the lush security systems that are used as both a plot device and a conspicuous display of wealth, his annual night of purge survival would probably be significantly more difficult than our white suburban family. His presence as a character adds a depth to the film that otherwise isn't there, and he provides a point of identification for the average viewer. And that allows for so much more scope in the building of what is actually a pretty detailed and fascinating extended Purge universe. The second film, The Purge: Anarchy, swings hard against its original confines by having a group of characters try and navigate basically the entirety of Los Angeles. It becomes apparent throughout that the government is deliberately exacting violence on poor neighborhoods. It also reintroduces the stranger from the first film as a revolutionary who hijacks the annual Purge broadcast in order to promote the revolutionary cause, and in the film's final scenes leads a violent pushback against the wealthy Americans participating in an auction of poor people to hunt for sport. In the third film, The Purge election year, a female politician fosters anti-Purge sentiment, and so she becomes number one on the establishment hit list. The film really doubles down on its anti-government sentiment with strong fascist imagery to associate with the new founding fathers, who are the ruling party responsible for the Purge. And it has the on-the-ground thugs be literal Nazis, complete with swastika skull tattoos. By the time we make it to the final film, The First Purge, it's a prequel, we have the KKK riding in on motorcycles to massacre black churches at the behest of the government, and tactical military units wearing leather Nazi uniforms. In this fourth installment, DeMonico handed over the directorial reins to Gerard McMurray, who most recently made Burning Sands, which is a film about black fraternities. Jason Blum, the founder of Blumhouse Productions, said, "We were definitely more inclined to look at a black director because the movie is about issues of race, and I think a white man or woman doing it might make it feel less authentic." And as such, the racial politics of Purge Night are even more noticeably central than they have been previously in this film, with almost all the white characters in the film being either neo-Nazi purgers or government officials. A lot of the criticism The Purge has copped as a franchise has been that it's too lofty in its ambitions of holding a mirror up to American culture and sort of not subtle enough in the execution. And look, I will be the first to admit that it is extremely unsubtle. The first Purge has a scene where the black protagonist strangles a man wearing a blackface mask to death and then peels the mask away to reveal his white skin. In the Purge election year, a bunch of Russian murder tourists dressed as American icons like the Statue of Liberty and Uncle Sam attempt to murder the woman fighting for systemic change. And those are just specific examples. I'm not even touching on the grim symbolism that sort of forms a background ambience. Bodies hanging from trees, bankers strung up by their ankles, women calmly sitting next to the mutilated corpses of their husbands. It's about as subtle as a brick to the face. But I guess what I wonder is, does that need to be a criticism? The first Purge film was released in 2013, so that's 3 years before America really decided to lean into its problems and elect a figurehead to make them worse. And the films have managed to feel kind of disturbingly prophetic with each passing year. The presence of vocal white supremacists as agents of not only violence, but of government-sanctioned violence in Anarchy, which was released in 2014, and Election Year, which was released in 2016, seems almost like a blueprint for the last 5 years. There are visible Nazis again. And I say visible because any minority group will tell you that fascist dickheads never really went away, but they're allowed to walk around now. Charlottesville, synagogue shootings, white power rallies, they feel safe enough to gather in large numbers with torches from home hardware stores and parade through the middle of a town. And they have vocal support from elected public officials. What's subtle about that? How do you even begin to subtly reflect racial injustice using the magic of cinema when reality is such a slap to the face? A lot of American cinema isn't particularly subtle to begin with anyway. If you've ever seen a slasher film, you're familiar with the concept of the final girl. She's the one who emerges victorious and blood-soaked at the end of a night of terror. In the 70s and 80s, she usually gets to survive because she's the most morally pure of the sacrificial teens. No drugs, no sex. Gotta be a virgin who can't drive. In later years, that trope's been subverted by women who are less morally pure and who survive on their strength alone, but they do it alone. And that's a real reflection of the value America places on this kind of self-made, bootstrap yanking BS that's especially harmful for minorities. It would be really easy for The Purge as a franchise to fall back on those tropes, but it doesn't. Instead, the films try really hard to keep hope alive in the midst of the chaos. In between all of the beheadings and the burning buildings, the focus is on working as a group as a means of survival. Every single film in that franchise shows resistance at a community level, whether it's through the provision of community-run ambulances on Purge night, or shelter for the homeless, or armed resistance. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we're seeing similar community-driven initiatives with the current wave of Black Lives Matter protests. We've got nurses and EMTs setting up medical tents on street corners. We've got people opening their homes to shield protesters. When your fear is derived from an axe-wielding serial killer at a summer camp destroying the innocence of teens, then it's probably fine to have a lone survivor to overcome. When the fear is state-supported violence designed to drive poor minority communities into the dirt, then individualism won't save you. Communities will. And again, how do you begin to navigate cinematic subtlety in that area? What would even be the point of attempting subtlety? When I was reading over the reviews for each of the films, I found it really interesting that a lot of the criticism about it being too much was coming from respected publications. You can't see me, I'm doing air quotes with my fingers. But like mainstream newspapers, that sort of thing. On the flip side, bloggers and smaller publications, often dedicated to niche areas of cinema, seem to really enjoy the franchise as a whole and appreciate its progression for what it was. BlackHorrorMovies.com, for example, which is a website dedicated to exploring the representations of Black people in the horror genre, says that while the first Purge is a mainstream movie, it's got revolutionary DNA, and despite its flaws, it has more heft and ambition than almost anything showing at your local multiplex. Part of the enduring success of the franchise, and its expansion into 4 movies, with a 5th movie pending and 2 TV seasons, seems to be this acknowledgement that the films don't stray too far from the reality of life as a minority in America, and that their calls for change aren't actually a simple fantasy. These films aren't cinematic masterpieces, but ultimately what I think is fascinating about the success of The Purge as a franchise is that its politics are kind of radical. Even in the first film, where it wasn't necessarily as well executed or sharply drawn, we see a heavy focus on the idea that the complacency of white middle-class American family units is something that is violently harmful. And we also see that their compliance with and even support of the system doesn't save them. When the scope of the franchise expands, we're shown the way that this supposed equalizing violence only serves to support the people in power, and that heroism in this environment actually takes the form of collective resistance. I joked earlier about horror movies being kind of obvious in their symbolism. The Purge films make the specter of state-sanctioned systemic violence literal, physical, and graphic. I think maybe once you move past monsters, the obvious nature of that symbolism and its proximity to reality is the real horror. And the recognition of that horror, and our desire to push back against it, is the driver for the film's success. Well, how's that for a melodramatic ending? And how's this for ruining it? For some reason, barely known to myself, I really do love the Purge films, and I really didn't get to spend enough of this episode talking about all of the background women featured in the franchise who choose to purge in sexy lingerie and scary masks, and not, full body armor. So, if you want to talk to me about why sexy bunny costumes make axe wielding more aerodynamic, you should hit me up next time you see me at the pub. Peace.